Good afternoon. I'm Robert Pondiscio, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and affiliate of the James Q. Wilson Program in K-12 Education Studies. I'm delighted today to host this discussion on what might be the single most important, and perhaps least openly addressed aspect of effective teaching, classroom management. We all know that no learning happens in a classroom that is not calm and orderly. Yet for many teachers, especially those new to the profession, managing student behavior is the most daunting challenge they face. It's also one of the top reasons teachers say they leave the profession, not because they don't care, not because they aren't prepared in their subject matter, but because they feel unequipped to run the room. But this isn't just about keeping order. It's a far more complex and human dilemma. Teachers need to balance compassion for the disruptive student who may be coping with trauma, mental health challenges, or other issues, with their responsibility to 25 other students whose education is disrupted by repeated misbehavior. The rights of one student cannot be allowed to routinely override the needs of all the others, and yet in too many classrooms, that's exactly what happens, often because the adults lack the tools, training, or the permission to act differently. That's why we're so fortunate to be joined today by Tom Bennett, one of the world's foremost experts on classroom behavior. Tom is a teacher, a researcher, and a policy advisor who founded Research Ed, a global grassroots movement that has reshaped how educators engage with research and practice. He's also the UK government's advisor on school behavior and the author of Running the Room, a frank and deeply practical guide to what works and what doesn't when it comes to building calm, focused, and respectful classrooms. His work is helping to re-legitimize the idea that structure and authority are not obstacles to learning, but prerequisites for it. Here's how the session will run today. We'll begin with a presentation from Tom, laying out key ideas from his book, Running the Room. Then we'll move into a panel discussion with two excellent respondents, followed by time for audience Q&A. And let me introduce for now those two respondents. The first is Carolyn D. Gorman. She's a policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute, where her work focuses on education reform, discipline, and school safety. In a recent City Journal article, she argued that the Trump administration's rescission or rollback of Obama and Biden era federal discipline guidance was a necessary corrective to policies that prioritized equity over order, suppressed misconduct data, and undermined both learning and teacher retention. Also joining us shortly will be Daniel Buck, a former English teacher and assistant principal at a classical charter school, and the newest member of our AEI education team, where he serves as the director of the Conservative Education Reform Network. Drawing on his years in the classroom and school leadership, Daniel has written extensively about how soft on consequences discipline policies have eroded structure in schools and undercut authority teachers need to maintain learning environments where all students can thrive. Well, we're grateful to you for being here, and we hope today's discussion helps illuminate a path forward, one that supports teachers, respects students, and restores the conditions necessary for real learning. So with that, I'm going to throw it to Tom Bennett for a brief presentation, and then followed by our discussion. Tom, over to you.
It is a huge pleasure. Let me just get this little PowerPoint up and we shall take it to the bridge. I hope you can see that, and if not, it doesn't really matter. It's a pleasure to be here. What an honor, and in such august company as well. I've only got 25 minutes, so I'll try to be brief here. I taught in exclusively inner city challenging classrooms for 15 years in London. And then after that, I spent, I guess, the next 10 years of my life wandering the earth like Gandalf, going to as many schools as possible to see what the best teachers and leaders did to try to get good behavior in their schools. I've seen about 1,500 schools now around the world. And I think one of the things I find most reassuring is that everywhere you go, children are very much the same. You know, they are not different creatures in different continents. You know, we very much share the same fundamental psychological components. And I find that tremendously reassuring. One of my main axioms, and this is something which is obvious to anybody who steps into a classroom, is that if children aren't behaving, then nothing else we're trying to achieve is going to happen. And I mean nothing else. Whatever you think education is for, whatever you think the priorities of a school should be, whether it's safety or equity or knowledge acquisition, creativity, critical thinking, vocational opportunity, and so on. There are hundreds of different options. Whatever you think teaching is for, whatever you think schooling is for, good behavior is fundamental to all of that. Because behavior is everything that we do. Behavior is the response of an organism to the stimulus of its environment. It's everything that we do. It's not just sitting still. So how we behave is obviously fundamental to the success of all of these features. If you want kids to learn stuff, right, their behavior is crucial. And you know, their behavior is probably one of the key factors in whether or not they learn anything in school. You know, do they turn up? Do they attend? Do they listen? Do they focus? Do they think? Do they try their best? Do they edit? Do they take criticism? Do they let other people speak? And so on. Remembering, of course, that teaching in the state sector will always be a communal activity, a social activity. There are multiple children in the room. So the behavior of the child isn't just important for that one child's learning, it's also important for the learning of everybody else. But it's also vital for the safety of everybody else in the room. Children have to understand that they can't do as they please. This is not the purge. You know, children, this is not the land of do as you please. Children have to follow protocols and etiquettes of conduct which make them safe and other people safe, which means that they have to be supervised by adults and so on. Their safety is the number one priority of anybody looking after their child. And yet often we forget that in our search for other abstracts. Mental health, and this is something perhaps Carolyn might speak to. I chaired the mental health panel for the Department for Education in the UK several years ago. We wrote the guidance for schools. One of the things we found was that schools are really bad at treating and diagnosing mental health problems because it's a specialist. It's a specialist activity. However, what schools can be extremely good at to promote good mental health is to create an environment which is safe, calm, and dignified. And that's one of the environments in which mental health risk factors are minimized and positive factors are optimized. Anyway, whatever you think school is for, behavior is behind all of it, which is why I always start with behavior. Before curriculum, before pedagogy, before everything else, I look and think about behavior. What are people doing? Or to put it another way, no child flourishes in chaos. The chaotic environment is anathema to the flourishing of a human being and to the social activity of human beings. Nobody flourishes in a chaotic environment apart from predators and aggressors and so on. And the people who suffer the most from a chaotic environment are the most disadvantaged children. The children with learning difficulties, the children with chaos in their home lives, children from traumatized or abusive home environments. Children with those kind of difficulties and disadvantages are the ones who suffer the most when they come to an institutional environment which is also chaotic. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is because very frequently people claim that any kind of focus on behavior and good order in a school environment is somehow the opposite of what these children need, where it's exactly what they do need. I'm really running through this, so I do apologize. You know, feel free to pick me up on anything. Historically, and this is particularly with emphasis on the UK, but I've seen it in every single country system that I've visited since, behavior is seen as something that people learn as they go along. It's not really something that many teachers learn in teacher prep or initial teacher training or education. It's something which teachers are expected to just kind of work out with children. It's often seen as a byproduct of good teaching, but then nobody tells you what good teaching is. So you're kind of stuck either way. And when I was in my teacher prep program, I remember being told I would learn this in school. And when I got to the schools, they said, "Oh, you should have learned this in teacher prep." You know, and I think it was the first time I smelled a rat in education. And I realized that maybe things weren't quite the way they should be. Teacher training for behavior management is very weak. I thought this was just the UK. In fact, I thought it was just me. When I led some national reviews for the UK, we found, no, it was everywhere. And then when I visited lots of other systems from Australia to the West Bank to Vancouver, I've seen it's exactly the same the world over. Behavior management is not emphasized in teacher preparation. We are sending people into the classrooms with very little skill base in how to manage the behavior of other people, let alone ourselves. Leadership training, may I just add, is frequently even weaker. I mean, most teachers might get half an hour of a lecture, but leaders tend to get even less than that. There tends to also be lots of myths and pseudoscience and essentially just junk taught to teachers about how to manage the behavior of other people. They'll be taught things like it's all about relationships, which is kind of true, but they never tell you how to build these relationships, which means people make terrible mistakes in the name of building a relationship, like making lessons easy or trying to be endlessly forgiving with children or letting them off with murder. And this creates what I call the unchangeable achievement gap. Because when children enter a school environment and their behavior isn't changed by that environment, where the institutional environment isn't optimized to improve their behavior, then children will behave as they see fit, which means that children from fortunate advantaged circumstances, where they've been exposed to lots of cultural capital, lots of social capital, and so on, these children tend to do much better at school than children who've come from chaotic or abusive environments. And so the disadvantage gap just gets wider and wider and wider. And as I mentioned, behavior management is frequently neglected as a topic for teachers when it is crucial and fundamental to the success of every teacher. It's often taught badly. And I think one of the bitterest ironies I've come across in my time is that behavior management is frequently taught by people who couldn't manage a challenging classroom. Or the behavior teacher prep programs are written by people who have never themselves taught in a challenging classroom successfully. And this is just one of the craziest axioms of the teaching environment. There's lots of people who seem to think that good behavior can be achieved in a classroom simply by a kind word, or that that if you just ask children nicely, they'll behave. As if we haven't thought of that, as if teachers haven't thought, you know what, I'm going to ask kids to behave, or they'll be told that all behavior stems from some kind of fanciful mental pathology, which again is not the case. I mean, most misbehavior is caused by perfectly normal spectrum human aptitudes, attitudes, and desires. People don't like to work hard. People don't like to think hard. People don't always want to do what we want them to do. People don't like to do things in groups. People don't like feeling judged by the school environment. There's lots of reasons, as Daniel Willingham would say, why students might not like to behave in a school environment, let alone pathological reasons which children can also bring with them to the school environment. So teachers' heads from the beginning are often full of crazy ideas about how to manage behavior, which are simply ineffective, which makes them worse teachers than before. And I say with a dark chuckle that when I finished my teacher prep program, I was worse at teaching than I was when I started it. I used to run nightclubs, and I think I was probably better at managing behavior after that than anything else. Now, some axioms here. As I mentioned, behavior is fundamental to everything we want children to achieve. The reason we want children to behave is because we want them to be successful. The reason we want them to be successful is because we care about them. So this is fundamentally an act of care. We don't want children to behave because we like telling them what to do. We don't want children to behave because we get a thrill out of bossing people about. That should preclude you from being in a school environment. We want children to behave because behavior is fundamental to their success. We want them to be safe. We want them to flourish as learners and human beings. We want them to coexist in an environment of dignity where they feel included, where they feel cared for, where they feel like they can succeed. So good behavior, therefore, means behavior that leads to that success. Good behavior isn't just about passive compliance. And another thing which I think is very important to understand is that our behavior doesn't just spring from nowhere, that our behavior is not hardwired into our psychology or our DNA. There are many species that are born with all of the behaviors they need in order to exist, like the fruit fly, which lives for 3 days. It gets born, it gets busy, it gets dead. Nobody teaches it how to fruit fly. It just does it. We are not like that. We've got big brains, extended infancy periods, but we are both helpless but also super learners. And it's how we can pass on intergenerational knowledge and create culture and the civilizations that we do, for good or for ill. Behavior, or rather the behaviors that we need children to exhibit in order to succeed in schools, are learned behaviors. Most behaviors that we want children to exhibit, like lining up or answering questions or taking part in group work or or demonstrating a thesis, or waiting their turn, or sharing, or being kind. These are not innate behaviors. These are behaviors which are learned through socialization. And children learn this from their parents, their families, their home environments, their media, and so on. And children who come from fortunate circumstances, not always rich, but fortunate circumstances, come to school bristling with these behavioral habits. And children who come from disadvantaged, chaotic environments, well, they've got habits too, but those behaviors are not so optimal to flourish in the school environment. Which brings me to a thing which I think is fundamental, which is that if behavior is mostly learned, then it can be taught. And if it can be taught, well, I know some people who are pretty good at teaching. In fact, they're called teachers, and they work in schools, and that's what we do. And everything we know and have learned about teaching for the past 25 years, all the recent advances in things like cognitive psychology, the sciences of learning and teaching, if you want to call that, also apply here. We can teach behavior. Not because we want children to be passive and compliant, because we want children to be successful. We want them to be amazing. We want them to flourish as human beings and as learners, but those behavioral habits have to be taught, which means that schools have to teach what I call the behavior curriculum. Now, I found in all my surveys of schools, and I've done many, many for both the government and for my own personal sake, is that the least effective strategy to manage behavior is just to react to misbehavior. It's just to wait for it to happen and then do something about it. Now, I am very pro doing something about it. You must react to misbehavior, but if that's all that you do, it's kind of like waiting for a fire to start before you put the fire out. You know, I mean, fire brigades are great. You know, I vote for fire brigades, but I would much rather things didn't catch fire in the first place. And that brings me to the next point, that the most effective classroom teachers and school environments I see are ones where they are rich in teaching the behavior curriculum, where children are taught not just what not to do, but what to do in order to be successful. So not just don't shout out and don't punch each other, which I'm going to hope is a low bar, but here's how to enter the classroom. You know, here's how to speak to one another. Here's how to respond to someone who's cruel to you. Here's what to say if you're upset. Here's what to say if you need help. You know, here's how to edit your own work. Here's how to walk down a corridor, for crying out loud. Here's how to conduct yourself in the canteen or a school trip, or, you know, when you need to go to the toilet or whatever. But the point is, you teach people what to do. And some of these behavioral habits seem incredibly axiomatic and mundane. But then mundane, you know, mundus of the world. These are things that people need to use in order to navigate the world. And the curse of knowledge reminds us that when we know how to do these things well, we forget how hard the world is for people who don't know how to do these things well. So teach them well, and let them show the way. And whenever a child comes to the school, there must be some kind of induction process whereby we say, welcome, we care about you, and because we care about you, we're going to show you how to be successful here. Now, if you exist in any credentialed profession, like an architect or an accountant or a lawyer, you know, you can't just practice these professions. You have to go through a certification process. Before you begin these professions, you know, you are required to take a long time in training how to be good at these professions so you can begin. And this is the approach we should take with schools. We should say to children, welcome to the school. Here's what we do in order to flourish and coexist and thrive as learners and as human beings, and to coexist as a social entity. It's kind of like saying to people, I want you to drive a car, but I'm not going to show you how to do it. I'd like to just see how you get on. Good luck learning how to drive a car. I mean, some people might flourish that way, but most people wouldn't. The best way to teach someone how to drive a car isn't by mistakes and punishments, but by teaching them this is how you do it. Now, the best schools do both, and the best teachers do both. They have really clear, explicit, this is how you do it, plus also, here's what happens if you don't do it. So we call this the behavior curriculum. I love this because it's a pedagogical model, and it's something that we all understand as educators. Which brings me back to one of my earlier points. Why do people misbehave? Often it's because they don't know what they should be doing. Secondly, we haven't habituated it into them. And thirdly, they don't understand why the behavior matters. So these three things are really, really important. You've got to teach kids explicitly, this is how to behave in this classroom or school. And then you have to habituate it by insisting upon it over time. And simultaneous with both those things, you have to teach them why the behavior matters. You know, I'm doing this because I care about you. I'm asking you to do this because I want you to learn. I'm asking you not to do that because I don't want you to hurt yourself. These kind of conversations are really useful to short circuit the expectation that many children have that we're only telling them what to do because we are fascists and bullies. And, you know, and this is an argument that can be made to parents as well. You know, why are you telling me to do this? Why are you telling me to turn off the PlayStation? You know, why are you crushing my poet's soul? And it's because I want you to go to bed because you need to sleep so you can have a great day tomorrow, right? So we come back to this idea of teaching, not just telling behavior, but teaching it to them. People already have lots of different habits. When they come to us, it's up to us to say, this is how we do things here. Now, this isn't fascistic or tyrannical. You know, I went to see a movie the other day in the cinema. There was a code of conduct. There was expectations of how we could all get the most enjoyment out of the film, which was the Fantastic Four, and I thoroughly recommend it to anybody of good sense. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit because I want to just make sure I hit some time here. I don't want to take it away from my fair colleagues. You create this culture in your classroom by teaching norms, i.e. what normal behavior is, by teaching routines, i.e. what's the sequence of behaviors, how do you leave the classroom, how do you enter the classroom, how do you ask and answer questions, really mundane stuff. Doug Lemov is great on this. How do you pass out books? You know, stuff which is the minutiae, the atoms of the culture that you're trying to create. And the joy of this is that classrooms and schools can often be quite different, but still be very successful. Successful classrooms and schools can be very, very different, but chaos always looks the same. And this, again, is another global phenomenon that I've witnessed. So that's the behavior curriculum. But one of the things that I don't want to leave without talking about a little bit is what do you do after behavior? What do you do when somebody misbehaves or behaves really well? And that's when we have to come to consequences. I'm going to suggest a couple of things here. That consequences are feedback to children. They are also a pedagogical process. They reinforce the learning of what they should be doing. And seen as that way, we can look at it as almost like formative assessment, that it's a way of giving them high quality feedback in order to improve future behavior. So you'll find that a lot of the feedback we give kids could be purely conversational, like, you know, asking Billy to get back in his seat, a little nudge, a little reminder, and so on. So that's very common for teachers to do, and that's feedback. You know, Billy, I've got my eyes on you. Billy, make sure you finish your work, and so on. But there might be also more subtle interpersonal cues, like being close, standing close to a student, or making eye contact, or using voice direction, or something like that. These are things that great teachers do all the time anyway. These are little nudges to remind students to do the right thing, and it also helps to scaffold in their heads what they should be doing. None of this makes children behave. All of it is an assist. All of this is a scaffold. They can still choose to ignore it, but if you take that scaffold away, their children will be much more lost. And then finally, you have what I tend to call structural consequences. And this is typically when you come to what the school would call the rules and the penalties and the rewards and so on for breaking rules. It's really important that these are predictable and reliable. The children need to know they exist in order to avoid these types of consequences. I'd like to say just a few things about this. This is how we create meaningful boundaries. If you don't have penalties in a school system, and I hope in the last 20 minutes I've managed to persuade you that I don't think penalties are the school system. They are simply the backstop to the school system. But if you remove penalties, then everything else falls apart. It's a small but crucial part of what we do. If you want to have a boundary in any community, there has to be a penalty for crossing that boundary, or the boundary is only a serving suggestion, which most students might comply with, but 5% of your kids will say, the hell with your serving suggestions. I am going to fly my freak flag freely, right? And we know this because we do it too. And some people do it a lot. So that's why we have boundaries. We make sure that everyone understands, if you cross this boundary, this will happen to you. Not because we hate you, but because we love you. Because we don't want you to incur this penalty. So you'll have, I mean, I'm sure you have the same thing in America, even in the land of the automobile. I'm sure you have speed limits and parking fines and no park zones, and you get a ticket or some penalties or something like that. Now, when you are speeding on the motorway, and I've seen Smokey and the Bandit, so I know you have police, the police such matters. If you get stopped by the police, they don't say to you, sir, what's your unmet need? They don't say to you, sir, what are you trying to communicate with your behavior? Let's talk this out. What do you really mean by this speeding? They just say, there's your damn ticket. And this doesn't deter everyone, but it's not meant to. It deters most people. Most people are deterred by speed cameras and traffic police and so on. Most people. That's a huge part of what we do in a school environment. Or to put it another way, there has never been a community of any scale, any size, or any duration which has existed without penalties for consequences. This is not an accident. And it's not because penalties are all that's required. Most people drive reasonably safely and well, not because they're scared of police, because they think it's the right thing to do and they can drive well. It's the same principle in any community. You can't police everybody's actions. We don't need to. What people need to know is that it's possible their actions may be policed if they choose to break them. So sanctions are really important, but they must be consistent. They must be predictable. And they must be a part of your school system which everyone understands how to use, which goes back to teacher prep and teacher training. And rewards are also really important too. But again, they're a small part. These are both short-term behavior modifiers for a child's actions. And yes, there must always be exceptions and accommodations for some children, because otherwise a rule which is universal or absolute is unjust. If a kid comes into your class and doesn't turn in their paper, in theory, you're supposed to give them a penalty. But if they say, I couldn't turn in my paper because, my house burned down today, and it's true, then, you might want to cut the kids some slack. There's lots of really good reasons why you would do that, but that's a human act of judgment. The consistency, the norm, should still be the norm as much as humanly possible. I'm going to stop there because I like to be punctual and I don't like to punish anybody else. So I think that's 25, maybe even 26 minutes. So I'm going to off board here and hand it back to the handsome and charming Robert Pondiscio. Thank you very much.
Boy, so much to talk about. I'm buzzing with responses to this, but I'll just throw out one or two before we throw it to our panelists. Tom, I'm reminded of the worst advice I think I ever got as a trainee teacher, which was this idea, and I'm not sure if I just happen to have a bad ed school professor or this is universal, but I was told that the best practice was to collaborate with your students on the classroom rules because then they would feel invested and take ownership of them. And it didn't take more than a day or two to realize that that was a vain hope. And as my first years of teaching went on, I remember saying in my exasperation something that I later found to be true, which is like, look, we just need one set of rules around here. They don't have to be mine, but the same rules should apply in my classroom, in Ms. Harris's classroom, in the gym, in the cafeteria. Then I visited schools later on where that was the norm. So I say this as a preamble to something that I think you almost glossed over. And again, I don't want to assume that my experience is universal, but you talked about whole school norms and whole school routines. And frankly, I'm just not sure how consistent that is in the American experience or whether what I was told is a best practice. Oh no, make it your own, collaborate with your students.
Yeah, yeah, co-constructing the rules with people who need to be subject to the rules. That sounds great. It
does, right?
It sounds so lovely, but there's never been a culture where that happened. There's never been a community where that. Did Moses come down from Mount Sinai with two empty stone tablets saying,
Let's
guys, what are we going
collaborate.
to do? Okay, sorry, facetious example. But okay, I once worked in it was basically like a young offenders institution. And I was teaching these kids, these were rough kids. And I said to them, hey guys, we're going to write the rules together, let's do that. And the kids looked to me like I was stupid because I was. And one of them put their hand up and said, so we'd like cigarette breaks every 5 minutes. We want to go for some smokes. And I kind of said, no, we can't do that, guys. We can't do that. And the kid looked at me and said, oh, so we're not writing the rules together. And I said, no, we're not really, if I'm honest. I want you to agree to the rules I'm going to put down. Kids want us to say, this is what you need to be doing here. That's the job of an adult. When we abdicate that responsibility, the authority doesn't vanish. It just goes to somebody else. And it goes to somebody else who may not have the best interests of the rest of the class at heart. So good luck to you on that one. That's one thing. Second thing you mentioned there about whole school rules, which is that Um, Communities fall apart when rules are invented on the spot ad hoc. In fact, when you create rules completely based on individual circumstances and individual moments, that is the least just system you can possibly come up with, because that's when you're going to get a system where people play favorites, people are biased, people discriminate against one another based on emotional predispositions, prior relationships, prejudices, and so on. I cannot think of a worse situation where and this, may I just say, this is really common in schools, where the leaders will hire the staff and say, go manage the behavior, like they've hired a bunch of plumbers and said, go fix these pipes. And you just do it the way you want. You just go be special. But that's not how it works in communities. Again, I referenced The Purge there as one of my favorite political texts. When you devolve all authority and decision making to the individual, good luck with that. Barricade your doors, because things do not go well. This is why we have speed limits, which are not variable depending on how beautiful you are or how well you know the local sheriff or whatever. That's the speed limit. And if there is a really good extenuating circumstance, the judge will sort that out. That's how we operate in communities and societies, which doesn't mean we don't have exceptions. We must have exceptions. But to have a society means to agree to abide by certain rules. And I'll finish on one last point here. I once watched one of my favorite documentaries about America, which was Crocodile Dundee, where the infamous Paul Hogan comes to Fifth Avenue. I think it's a documentary where, and he's, the joke is, of course, that he's, if you remember the film, which is a terrible film, he's this guy from the outback. He lives in the middle of nowhere. He comes to Manhattan in the 80s, and it's just busy. It's just people, the teeming hordes of humanity washing over him. And he says, my God, how many people are here? And his partner, Linda Kowalski, says, oh, I think it's 9 million people at rush hour. And he goes, 9 million people? Boy, they must all really get on with each other. And kind of, forgive me, it's a terrible joke, but it's kind of true. That if you coexist in a society, you do all kind of get along with each other. And if you don't, well, welcome to the state of nature. Welcome to the way humanity was before we created civilization. I'll stop ranting now.
Nasty,
Sorry.
brutish, and short. I am eager, Tom, next time I get pulled over to discuss with the officer my unmet needs and what the speed limit was communicating to her, and perhaps
I was really angry.
And...
I was really angry. I'm sorry, officer. Oh, well, if you're angry. Exactly. If you're angry, that's fine. Sorry, I'm going to jump in here. I've got to jump in. I had I have a lot of people saying, oh, well, he was upset, so let the kid off for doing something. On a serious note, this is what people who are involved in domestic abuse say. I was angry, that's why I hit you.
Yeah.
And if we're teaching this to children, that when you're upset, you can vent like that, then we're teaching them really, really bad later life lessons. I will stop now.
No, that's a good and earnest point. Thank you. Carolyn Gorman, let's bring you into the conversation as our mental health expert today. It's impossible to unwind the conversation about student discipline and the conversation about mental health, and what I think we can probably all agree is a bit of a mental health crisis coming out of COVID. Can you speak briefly in your work to the evidence that you've seen behind youth mental health treatments in school? Are they effective, and how do they intersect with this discussion on student behavior?
Yeah, well, the punchline is they're not that effective, and actually a lot of what Tom was talking about is sort of good in and of itself for sort of mental health, and some mental health treatments can actually be counterproductive to what schools are trying to do. But one thing I'd like to do before I get into treatments, if it's okay, I just want to kind of frame this a little bit, because we tend to call everything a mental health problem these days, and that affects sort of what treatments we deliver. But one way I kind of like to set the conversation is by saying that 100% of kids and teens have emotions and experiences that are not pleasant, but are a normal reality of human life, like feeling anxious or depressed and facing hardships like abuse. About 20% of youth may have a mild or moderate emotional or behavioral challenge that's classified as a diagnosis in what's called the DSM, which is the main guide used in American psychiatry. And then about 5% of youth have a serious emotional disturbance that causes substantial impairment and disruption in everyday life. Now, most mental illnesses don't appear for most people until their late teens and early 20s, and that's sort of this sort of framework and that point is worth laying out, because in the school context, we have to be wary of sort of what we're calling a potential mental health problem, which today is again sort of pretty much everything. And we call everything a mental health problem because we have for decades had sort of a public health model of trying to raise awareness of conditions, to encourage early intervention and prevent those conditions from developing. And that kind of public health model is a lot of what gets implemented in schools. So in education speak, this is sort of like tier one programs. They're kind of universal across kids, broad-based. Fundamentally, all of these kind of public health model programs have the same goal, which is to direct more people into mental health treatment upstream or at the first sign of distress. Because, we want to try to, again, sort of prevent this. So we might be teaching kids how to label their emotions, or telling them to pay attention to their emotions, or encouraging them to get help when they feel bad, just in case it's the sign of something worse. We also kind of preemptively give kids mental health treatment if they go through things that we think might make them develop a mental health problem, like poverty or abuse or even bad education outcomes themselves. And the hope is sort of that giving people preemptive treatment is going to help them cope with their circumstances. But these treatments, unfortunately, don't work that well. So I should say mental health treatment typically is medication or therapy. There can also be more sort of physical or structural interventions, like keeping someone under observation or putting nets under bridges to prevent suicides. But these sort of psychotherapy and medication mental health treatments, they're really not a magic bullet, even though we sometimes act as if they are. And even though we do a lot for prevention, mental health treatment is actually not preventative. Treatments don't prevent mental illness from developing. So not only are they not preventative, they're not always effective. They're much less effective for kids than they are for adults. And even when they are effective, that doesn't necessarily mean that what's effective is what's being used. There's a lot of low quality mental health care out there. So chances are what's being delivered is not necessarily best practice. And just with any other medical intervention, mental health treatments can not only be ineffective, but they can be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
The main takeaway here is that mental health treatment just should not be the first line of defense. And that's, even when we're talking about outside of a school setting, but in a clinical setting, we really want to sort of make judicious use of it for kids. We want to use it when problems are really serious and benefits might outweigh the risks. Now, for schools are just getting asked to do a lot of things all the time that are not what we might expect schools to typically do. And whatever you think the role of schools are, what schools do should sort of outweigh any other given thing that they can do. And given how ineffective mental health treatments and sort of pseudo mental health treatments can be, they just end up being a very low value trade oftentimes for really anything else that schools can be doing.
Daniel Buck, first, welcome to AEI. For those who don't know, Daniel is the newest member of our education policy team, and also probably, I think it's fair to say, the most recently removed from the classroom. You were still in school as an administrator as recently as a month ago, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Yep. Just at the risk of getting meta, these conversations that we have monthly here about practice serve a dual audience. We are trying to speak to practitioners, but it's AEI. We're an ed policy shop, so invariably some number of policy folks are also tuned in. So I'm hoping you can reflect for a couple of minutes, Dan, about the kind of behaviors that teachers deal with, that you've seen both as a teacher and administrator. And anything else from the practitioner perspective that policy folks either are not aware of or might be missing.
Yeah, I polled or surveyed or chatted with, it was over 200 teachers last year. Kind of sent out a message on the interwebs and then just started these conversations with 200 teachers. And I was just picking their brains about what was on their minds, what was frustrating them, trying to get a sense of what was going on in schools that was greater than my N of one, my own experience. And a lot of what they were telling me, they're the things that we see in the news, teachers being cussed out, teachers being threatened, fights in the hallway. And that was just all of the teachers were talking to me about behavior and the frustration of it. They were using words like the oppressive feeling in the building, not this, kind of stolen term or the other meaning of oppressive, like we were oppressing the students, but like it was an overhot building. That's all you could think about, and everyone was worried about it, and you were feeling this tension in the hallway, wondering when was something going to happen, when was a kid going to pull a weapon, when was another kid going to have an outburst that now the class has to be evacuated and all the kids have to be shuffled in the hallway while one kid throws a tantrum and tips desks. And there's kind of this fear, and it's distracting, and it's what the kids are thinking about. It's what the teachers are thinking about. And they can't focus on learning because they're so focused on that oppressive feeling constantly in the building. But we read about that often in the news. It shows up on our social media feeds. What I think a lot of policymakers miss is that what really eats away at teachers aren't those big eruptions, the fights in the hallway, the brawls in the lunchroom, because that is so egregious that it's usually cracked down on and teachers are going to get support there. What really eats away at educators is just the little daily mundane acts of disrespect. When a teacher tells a student, Johnny, can you return to your seat? And they look at the teacher and deliberately go and sit in somebody else's spot. When they ask the student to stop squeeping or making noise purposely in the back of the classroom, and the kid just rolls their eyes and keeps doing it. It's those little acts that communicate to the teacher, not only do, I as a student not respect you, but I don't think you're worthy of respect. And that just eats away at a teacher's confidence, at their own control of the classroom. And then the other thing, policymakers often focus on just the one student who's misbehaving. And we'll discuss, this student has a right to an education. Great, awesome, love it, on board with that. But so do the other 19, 20, 29, 25, 30, however many other students are in that classroom. They also have a right to an education too. And if we let that one kid off the hook, we say, well, he's having a bad day. So you know what? We're going to bring him to the office, let him cool down on the beanbag chairs, give him a bag of hot Cheetos, and bring him back to the class. That communicates to all of the other students, well, you're a chump if you follow these teachers' directions. Your education is not going to be protected. And that kid comes back in, acts a fool again. And because we've had compassion for that one student, we've kind of torched the education of all the other kids in that classroom. So we can't forget about not just the one kid, but the 29 other kids in the classroom.
Yep. No, and I don't think it's overstating things just to say, as I think you certainly alluded to, what a psychic drain this is on teachers. For those of us who've worked in difficult environments, you're absolutely right, Daniel. I mean, the ticking time bomb feel of that, like something's going to happen, can be overwhelming. And we know from data, I've read this in your work over the years, that teachers, when they leave, it's sure, pay them more, give them respect, but these are the types of things that end careers. Look, in the walk up to this event on social media, there were any number of comments about IEPs, about kids with special needs. So I don't want to avoid that topic because it's a real dilemma, a real source of conflict here. So I'd like to address it directly. Tom, I'll start with you, but it's really for Carolyn and Dan as well. How do you respond to critics who argue that I don't want to call it a get tough, but a be consistent, a behavior curriculum, to use Tom's phrase, risks alienating students with complex needs, such as those from disadvantaged backgrounds who have IEPs or other diagnosed issues?
It's a great question. And if we don't address that question, then nothing we say is worth anything, because so many kids come from environments which disadvantage them in some way. So how do we answer that? And the answer is basically this, is that the environment which the environment which benefits all children, which is the rising tides that lifts all ships, is an environment which is calm, safe, stable, predictable, coherent, and dignified, and where everybody feels like they matter and what they do and say matters. I mean, everyone feels like they're part of a community, which requires them to understand how to be part of that community physically and behaviorally. Now, so that's number one. Number two is that if you put a child with a difficulty or disadvantage in a chaotic environment where people can do as they please, more or less, then they are disproportionately disadvantaged by that. And every school I go to where they've got really good, clear guidelines and protocols and etiquette and so on, these are the schools where parents of children with special needs disproportionately apply. Because children with ADHD, ASD, social, emotional, mental health issues, and so on, these children really need calm, safe, predictable environments. If you've got a child with trauma, for example, I know that the word trauma has enjoyed a somewhat tortured definitional journey over the past 75 years. But let's say a child's come from an abusive, traumatic background in the way that we might commonly understand it. You know, what does that child really need? I tell you what they need. They need a safe, calm, predictable environment with with a sense of coherence and dignity. Which doesn't mean we don't make some special accommodations for them. For example, you know, if a child has got autism spectrum disorder, it may be that, for example, we allow them to wear a clip-on tie or a different fabric, or a child with mobility issues might be allowed to leave the classroom earlier, or a child with an anxiety disorder may be temporarily excused from some kind of public speaking duty, maybe, depending on the circumstance. But the point is that these exceptions do not define the coherence of the common rule. And so I get quite annoyed about this, because when we allow children to not do the things that we ask them to do, and we've already thought about their circumstances and we've made maybe some allowances for them, but when we just simply say, oh, you don't have to do it, why? Because you can't do it. We're telling them they can't do it, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I do loads and loads of focus groups with children with special needs in every school I go to. And one of the most common things they say to me is that they don't expect me to do anything. I'm not expected to produce any work. And if I get in trouble, I'm never really in trouble for things much. I just get a chat and then I'm returned again. These children know we think less of them. They know that we're treating them like second-class citizens. And I think that the people who claim to care about these children have become what they despised, which is the oppressors of these children.
Yeah.
So one parent, sorry, if I may, just to add on, a parent I spoke to in preparation for this session described an incident where her daughter was reprimanded for interrupting a teacher, leading to a behavioral outburst that could have been misinterpreted, she said, as defiance. How can teachers be better prepared to identify antecedents to behaviors, especially for students with disabilities, to prevent escalation and to ensure fair responses?
Well, one thing that teachers can do is set clear expectations. And just exactly as Tom was saying, that is important for any student, whether or not they have, something that's diagnosable, something serious or not. So we use the term serious emotional disturbance in youth because we oftentimes don't know what something is. We don't want to be so permanent in our labeling. And so when you have these options of different treatments that you can implement, whether that be mental health treatments or otherwise, the sort of structural treatments that Tom is talking about is good for everyone. And so that is something that we should be helping equip teachers with, is to sort of help maintain clear expectations. And look, I mean, kids experience real emotional difficulties, real distress. I'm not dismissing that at all. But even in the face of real distress, to Tom's point, we should still give them clarity about what expectations are. And it might even be more important in those cases to give kids clarity about what the expectations are, because, as Tom said, otherwise we're sort of sending them a message that we don't have any expectations for their future, and we don't give them any sense of control over their future. And that can be worse for mental well-being.
Daniel, you've written about certain pervasive ideas in education that suggest that harsh discipline doesn't work, it's too strict, racist even. From your work and experience, why do you consider those ideas misleading?
Because they just don't work in practice.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a few theories of action for improving student behavior. There's kind of the PBIS approach that we're just going to incentivize positive behavior, only acknowledge and reward the positive behavior, and then kind of everything else will fizzle out and take care of it itself. There's more of the restorative justice approach, the root cause analysis that Either the student is misbehaving because they're hungry, that they didn't hugged enough when they were young, whichever it is, or there's some sort of procedural error, and we just need to fix that. And the system's broken or their background is broken. And if we just account for that, then we're all naturally good. So we're going to behave as we should because the system has been fixed and, whatever root cause is causing this has been ameliorated. And so I'll act accordingly. Or there's kind of I don't want to say the approach that we're all advocating here, but the acknowledgement that we also need disincentives for misbehavior. And when you look into what actually happens in practice, when these kind of alternative theories of action are put in practice, they just don't work, especially if they're put in by themselves. So PBIS has probably the most research supporting it, but it's only at elementary school and the impacts are small. Restorative justice has very little, if any, research into it. And the research that does exist finds that either it has no effects and puts a huge strain on teacher time, or it has negative impacts on math scores, and especially those students who are from poor backgrounds. And most importantly, all of the case studies that we have where schools get rid of any kind of disincentive, suspensions, detentions, expulsions even, what are the results of this? Standardized test scores tank. Students are skipping school more, so absenteeism goes up. And students actually spend more time in suspension because instead of getting 1 day in-school suspension for talking back to the teacher for the third time that week, they're getting a 5 to 10 day suspension for fighting in the hallway or doing drugs in the bathroom. The severe behaviors increase. So ironically, students spend more time in their punishments. Now, no one is advocating for some sort of approach to behavior where you might say, beatings will continue until morale improves. We're not saying punish, punish, punish. All we need to do is punish. Tom gave a great opening where he says we need to teach students. We need to have a behavior curriculum. So any good behavior system is going to reward good behavior. It's going to acknowledge the greatest successes in the schools. Any good behavior system is going to look and see, are there procedures in the building that are causing these conflicts? I worked in one school in the inner city where we were having fights in the lunchroom, and we realized the way students were lining up, just students were crossing paths, and it was facilitating more conflict. So there can be a little procedural fix where you change how do students enter and exit the lunchroom. No one's saying we don't analyze the procedures, the policies at a school and try to make them better. No one is a sociopath and saying we should never have a follow-up conversation with a 6-year-old and say, what happened? Why did that happen? What can we do better next time? Some sort of restorative conversation. But disincentives, consequences are a necessary, insufficient, but a necessary part of any behavior system. If you misbehave, you will get some sort of consequence.
Carolyn, you wrote a paper not that long ago for the Manhattan Institute on the subject of student behavior. Can you, okay, I'm going to name you Secretary of Education now. Tell us your preferred policy fix here, or let me, sorry, not beg the question. Is there an appropriate role for policy here in terms of student behavior and tone setting, or is this just something we have to do at this school and district level?
Yeah, well, I prefer local intervention, but the federal government does have a responsibility to enforce civil rights violation. Now, the paper that I wrote sort of has talked about the approach that's been taken for about the last 10 years. And essentially, since the Obama years, the federal government has threatened schools with civil rights investigations if suspensions and expulsion rates are racially disparate. So essentially, the federal government has assumed that if racial disparities existed, it was because of racial bias and racial discrimination, even though its own guidance recognized that discipline rates are influenced by a lot of complex factors. Now, Daniel was talking about incentives. The practical implication here was that schools responded to the threat of investigation by depressing their number of reported suspensions and opting not to discipline students, implementing these restorative practices. And all this has sort of had the unintended consequence of often harming the students that the policies were meant to help. Since school discipline reforms have been in place, school shootings have increased, school violence has increased, classroom disorder has increased, drug use, gang activity, bullying, teacher attrition, all of these things have increased, and the greatest shifts have happened in schools where minorities are the majority of the student body. So, what we have seen is probably what good policy does not look like, because we didn't get that much good out of it. And so that's something that we have to consider. And Daniel was talking a little bit about what I think is a really important trade-off that we also need to consider in the policy sphere, and that is you might be trying to spare a bad outcome for one student, but who are the other students that are affected by these policies? So, if one student is spared a suspension, you still have this class of, 25 plus kids who are often also from, really disadvantaged backgrounds, and those students also suffer. So it's a trade there that we have to be at least aware of.
At the risk of painting with too broad of a brush, it sounds to me, Carolyn, as if federal policy just assumes that you show me a disciplinary action and I will show you a school or teacher failing.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right.
Okay. Tom, one of the things I like about your thought and your work is because of confirmation bias, it echoes a view of mine. You've expressed skepticism about schools solving complex social problems. We see that here in the States as well. Can you speak for a moment about what you believe is the appropriate scope? Because we don't teach in a vacuum, right? Kids are going to bring their problems to school. We can't be blind to that and say it's not my problem to solve. But where do you draw the line as a practical matter in tackling issues like mental health, social unrest, some of the outside problems that kids bring to school and which manifests itself in behavior issues?
Yeah. Oh God, loads to say about this. First of all, that schools are the natural punch bag of any politician that wants to look like they're making a big change really quickly in response to this week's hot potato, live wire, third rail social topic. And we get this in the UK as well. I've seen it in every country I go to. So there may be a rise in gang violence or misogyny or knife crime or something, something's going on in the world. And so they say, right, we need to have a lesson on this. We need to have a lesson on this. We need to teach kids about this at school. And it's very noble, and the intention is good, but then, of course, we all know what the road to hell is paved with. And the problem is that every time somebody says, let's teach knife crime, and, well, first of all, what are you going to do? What are you going to teach? Teach that it's bad. Okay, great, fine. Anything else? Secondly, is that really going to change the attitudes of the children involved in it without changing what's going on in their lives? And thirdly, what are you going to take out then? What are you going to remove in order to teach about cooking, accountancy, knife crime, social unrest, whatever, because we have a finite amount of time. We have, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, times however many weeks a year. So there's that. The second thing, which is that, politicians do this because it's kind of a Jesuit philosophy, isn't it? Give me the child, I'll give you the man. Well, they seem to believe, give me the education system and I'll give you the society. But we have to acknowledge the shortcomings and the realities of what schools can actually do. Schools were set up in most Western liberal democracies round about the early 20th century in terms of compulsory mandated state education. Schools were set up with a fairly brief remit of teaching children reading and writing, and more broadly, perhaps you may say the liberal education of teaching children a little bit of science, a little bit of humanities, music, art, all those things, so they can navigate and understand the world. So that's it. That's the best we can do. We're going to teach you this stuff. And once you know this stuff, it'll help you with your life. And you find your own way after that. And we have to acknowledge that school is a stepping stone through these parts and processes. What school is not is some kind of miracle society changer. It's the weirdest way to look at it. It's kind of like the tail trying to wag the dog. And because of these expectations, this is how we can harrow education by completely stripping it of its very raison d'etre, why it exists in the first place, which is we want literate, numerate children who understand science and humanities and history and poetry and all the magic we're trying to teach them, and maybe get them jogging a little bit too, and then on you go. So that's the remit of a school. I mean, schools focused on that, they can do it really well. Nobody goes to a hospital and says, yeah, but but when your patients left, what did they think about equality? There's a remit there of a restaurant or a hospital or anything. And if everyone focuses on that, then we can do pretty good. When I was a kid, I used to read too many comics. I think I may have mentioned this. And I kind of wanted to save the world, one of these narcissistic fantasies. But at least it was a good one, I hope. And then as I grew up, I realized I could barely save myself. But I think the thing which got me through this was realizing that all you can do is you take that little bit in front of you, that 1 meter square, and you improve it and you make it better than it was when you found it. And that, as a teacher, that's what you do with your classes. And as a principal, that's what you do with the kids that come in through your doors and in your community. This idea that we can fix society is bonkers. And, or put it this way, show me when it's ever worked. And then come back to me.
I admire the aspiration. We all got into this work for that reason, for that impulse, right? But I don't disagree with you at all. Let's go to some audience questions. And I love this first question because it is literally the first question that I wrote on my notes as you're speaking. How would you advise a teacher to start making a change within a school where the culture of the school and its board are the opposite of your advice? The way I was thinking about this is I'm sure that there's some number of folks listening to us who are, like many new teachers certainly are, desperate for help. The cavalry isn't coming. My administration is on board. I'm being given that advice about how, well, if your lessons were more engaging, maybe kids wouldn't misbehave, etc. If you are that one-man band, Tom Bennett, if you are not part of a whole school initiative, what can you do?
A great question. I get this question a lot because it's very common that it's natural for an adult to go into a school environment, and even if you're just kind of sensible and you're okay with kids and you've got perhaps some self-confidence, your natural instinct is to perhaps lay down some etiquette and protocol and then call kids out and challenge them when they don't meet it. That's the natural tendency, I think, for most human beings. But you'll go to a school that says, don't do that. Don't do that. Work it through with them. Let them let off some steam. Talk to them about it. Send them to the school therapist. Give them an emotional support beagle. Whatever wackadoodle idea the school's got. And you're sitting there thinking, hang on, I think I know more than the people who are in charge, but they must know something. This is so common. It was my experience. I used to run an agony uncle column. This is one of the most common questions I got. Okay, there's loads of answers to this. Number one, first of all, the school might cherish your autonomy, which is a double-edged sword, but the good side of that sword is maybe it will let you do the things you want to do. So do them. Lay down the rules, have high expectations, challenge kids, be an assertive personality, call them out, penalties, praise, all that stuff. If you've got the power to do it, Captain Burblesing once said to me that if you are a great teacher in a terrible school, you can still get great behavior. It's just 20 times harder, and maybe harder than most people can manage. It is possible, but her phrase was, it's like being a warlord in a failed state, right? Which is kind of an Afghani metaphor to some extent. So it is possible. The second thing you do is you can form your own networks within the school. There will be other people who agree with you. I'm not saying unionize, but kind of, form your own communities of co-support. You can send kids out to one another and so on. This is, of course, if the school's completely dysfunctional. You can try to manage upwards. You can look and see if the school's got behavior policy. Is the school even using its own behavior policy? Does it have one? Because if it isn't, then you can press them to do it. Again, this is hard. Managing upwards is hard. And the third thing, this is the nuclear option. Pull the ripcord. There are schools that deserve you. If a school doesn't deserve you, if you can leave, I know that's not easy. I'm just saying it's the ultimate goal if you can.
I'm reminded when I was teaching in the South Bronx that an administrator once described my classroom management style as authoritarian, thinking to insult me. And I said, well, thank you. It's like, I'm enforcing the rules because you don't. But we do have a uniform policy that nobody else in the school seems to take seriously.
Why do you hate children, Robert? Yeah.
Can I just say, from a mental health perspective, having teachers actually help enforce the idea about what a real problem is really useful. An anecdote I give all the time, and I have not been a teacher, so I am really empathetic here, but I had a very impactful teacher in high school. I was one of those pretentious students who genuinely thought that I would not get into college and get a career unless I had all A's. I got a B once, and it was truly the end of the world for me. And this teacher just sort of laughed at me when I asked her to change the grade and was like, get a real problem, which of course made me upset. And then I went home and like cried to my dad about how this teacher told me to get a real problem, who then laughed in my face and also told me to get a real problem. And in hindsight, that teacher gave me something very, very important, which was perspective as to sort of like what was worth getting upset about. And I've interviewed her since, and she's told me, she would never tell a student that anymore because she's scared that she might traumatize them. And it makes me really sad for what teachers must feel like they need to not do or not help students understand for sake of their mental health, when that perspective was really useful for me. If we don't teach kids what a small problem is, it becomes a big problem. So hopefully some teachers can communicate, they care about you. And that's, again, to Tom's point, that is why they're trying to help you understand what a real problem is.
Yeah, that's right out of Doug Lemov and Teach Like a Champion. No, I'm enforcing the rules because I care about you and because I care about your outcome. That's exactly right. I love this question that's just come in. What can happen to the behavioral norms of a school with enough pushback from parents? What happens when a school sets its consequences too strict for schools' parents and the parents cause a stir, or I suppose in the opposite direction as well? How can a school hold strong to its principles on discipline in the face of those external challenges? I'll throw that to anybody who wants to throw themselves on that grenade.
I can take that. At that point, it really becomes a question of if the administrator will have the spine to enforce the rules. And I think this is school board policy is going to play a big factor in this too. The members who actually set the behavior policy and code of a building, of a district. When I was a assistant principal, you're kind of the discipline guy in the building, and having a well-written discipline code was the tool, the foundation, pick your cheap metaphor, that kind of empowered me to hold the line. Because I could say I knew what was right to give little Johnny a detention for whatever it was. When the parent comes back to me, I can also say, I'm just enforcing the rule. And you might be upsetting the parent in that moment, but when it's the policy, there's not a whole lot that they can then do aside from send you an angry email or maybe say something mean about you on Facebook. But all of the other parents are going to appreciate you for it. I saw this happen in the reverse, where it was a school that was chaotic, that was terribly run. And the administrator there, I was still teaching, constantly caved to parent demands, wanting to appease parent after parent after parent. And in appeasing a few minority parents, not necessarily minority in their race, but the minority view, right? They wanted more leniency. In trying to appease that small group of parents, they created a school that no one wanted to attend. And this choice school went from having wait lists that were hundreds of students long to none. And they could barely get enough students in the building to kind of meet their bottom line. So an administrator can take confidence also knowing that just they are doing the right thing for their school. They're doing the right thing for their students, even if they're going to upset some people along the way.
Yep. I'm thinking too, in New York City, where I spent my teaching career, among charter school operators, we all say that, look, we wish that kids or parents were choosing us for our curriculum, for our school model. Charter is a synonym for safety. So my assumption, Tom Bennett, is that most parents are pretty much on board with schools that are, in other words, it's probably the rare parent that is complaining about excessive discipline, right?
I wouldn't say so. I tell you what's really interesting is that when you go to if you go to a school in a really challenging socioeconomic environment where the demographic is often characterized by poverty or drug use or domestic violence and so on, in an environment like that, you will frequently get a real, we would call it kind of a sink school, where all the really challenging kids end up going. And the problem with a school like that is that you frequently get children coming from chaotic family and home environments. Most parents love their children more than we ever could because it's their kids. But I'd say about 2% of parents are toxic to the point that they're literally so chaotic themselves. They've got their own problems, drug addiction, and so on. Right. So that's a thing, mental health issue, or even just in general, kind of intransigence against authority and all kinds of things. So you do get some school environments where an enterprising new principal or administrator comes along and tries to shake things up and say, right, we're going to have some rules, etiquettes, and norms. And you do often get tremendous pushback. And this is, something I've seen a lot in the UK and Australia in particular, where parents say, this is far too strict now. My little Billy got in trouble 3 times this week. And all he did was tell the teacher to go F himself, and it's kind of, and you get these really angry parents on television and usually in local press. Do you remember newspapers? In the local press, and you'll get like, the angry mother on the photograph and the glum child. And she'll say, my little Billy just wants to learn, and he got in trouble 3 times. And it's kind of like, so you do get this enormous pushback from parents who themselves think their children should be allowed to do as they please, who can't stand at the fact that kids are coming home saying, oh, I got in trouble again, I hate the school. And the parents think, well, I'll just placate the child by complaining to the school. What's really interesting is if the principal or the admin holds the line, 6 months later, parents love it. Why? Because the kids are safe, they're flourishing, they're happy, they're doing lots more than they used to do. They're coming home talking about their work and feeling good about themselves, and they're not getting punched anymore. And it becomes a tiny minority of parents to push back. The vast majority go, wow, this is amazing. So actually the phenomena of parents pushing back against schools being too strict is very common. You go to the Netherlands, you go to Flanders and Belgium, and countries like this, which really, really, really prize individual autonomy and the sense of personal liberty. You combine that with affluent middle-class families, and you've got a powder keg of entitlement. So it's more common than you might think. But once parents see it in action, they love it. And they're crawling over broken glass to get into these schools.
Another teacher question here, and this is, I assume, predicated on our discussion earlier about individual classroom rules versus whole school rules and norms. What would you recommend a teacher do if they see, based on their experience, that the school administration practices regarding correcting misbehavior are not working? Tom, I know you said earlier, well, your nuclear option is to leave, but in between then and then, what can an individual teacher do to change a whole school culture?
A lot of it depends on your rank and the authority that rank bestows upon you. So, for instance, I go to lots of schools where if you are the head of a faculty, if you're head of a department or a year group or something like that, then you've got quite a lot of autonomy over how that runs. Again, this tends to be when the do as thou wilt is the benefit to the person. So you can create your own, construct your own norms, etiquette, protocols and procedures, removals, exits, and so on. If you are just a teacher, if you are rank and file, your primary source of influence here is, as I said before, is going back to the school policy and seeing if the school isn't implementing its own policy, in which case you have got a lever with which you can move the world. Secondly, you can use your own personality. You can say, this is what we should be doing. You can demonstrate, possibly look at my classes, they run much better. This would be a great way for other people to do it too, and so on. Because teachers are often quite susceptible to infection by example. Teachers love to see things happening. Principals love it too. Principals love solutions. If you can say to a principal or admin, look what I'm doing, it's much easier. Aren't my classes calm? You get no call outs from me. Why? Because they're calm. Why? Because it's what I do. So let me teach the other teachers in the school. The problem with these approaches, and it's not really a problem, it's just a challenge, is that these are ambitious approaches that require you to be organized, confident, and have the capacity and the time to do so. Now, as we all know, teachers have got nothing but time, right? They're just, their feet up, they've got their cowboy boots up on the sofa, smoking a cheroot and just loving life because they've got nothing to do. In reality, they've got everything to do. You have no time whatsoever. So it is very difficult to collectivize like that. But there are things you can do. I don't want to advocate helplessness either.
Could I ask Daniel a question? Because he said something really interesting earlier, and I just wonder if it's useful for teachers. I'm interested in this idea that, you noticed something was happening in the school lunch line, and here's a place where there can be an intervention that's not as potentially controversial as, say, changing the school discipline policy. How did that happen? How did that get changed? And is that something that happened on sort of the individual teacher level?
Great question.
I think that was just my room was right next to the lunchroom, and I was talking with the dean of students and kind of pointed that out, and it was changed. So that was actually pretty small, just noticing, hey, maybe we should do it differently that way. It didn't fix everything though, because again, this school still did not use consequences. So it kind of made it better. But as much as we want to discuss improving procedures or routines or all of these kinds of things, if you don't have any kind of discipline code in place or enforced, it's like trying to install windows and gutters to keep the water out of your house when you don't have walls and a roof. So there are things that teachers can do there. You can sit down and say, what are the consequences that are available to me? Can I pull a kid from recess or lunch or gym or whichever it is? Can I make calls home? I used to use my drive home as my time to call parents and converse with parents. List out what are the consequences that are available to you. And I'm just going to clarify, I'm not advancing a consequence-only approach. That's just usually what's missing. Teachers, build procedures and routines in their sleep. They have those, but those aren't going to do much unless you have this kind of base structure in place. You can set rewards and take them away. Incentives actually work best if students see, oh, we're going to have a movie day, but then if there are 5 class, checks against it, they lose it in a month out. It's more motivating than the pebble jar that you'll see in a lot of classes that students build up to it. The threat of taking it away is far more motivating than building towards it. And then I would also say, if it's on behavior, this is one fight where if you pick that argument with your administration, you are going to have you're going to have your colleagues back. There, many times in schools, as the leader of the director of the Conservative Education Reform Network, my politics are not a secret. There are many times where I was fuming during staff meetings, wondering, do I raise my hand and make a fuss, or do I just bite my tongue and move on? And behavior is always the one where I was that, thorn in my admin side and would raise my hand. And anytime I spoke about it, I would get applause in the meeting from my colleagues. And I'm not saying that to fluff my own feathers, to say I was a great rhetorician, but all of the other teachers sitting in that room see how bogus a lot of this stuff that they're encountering is, and they are begging for one person to stand up and say, please, can we stop this and do something about it? And if you're that voice in your school, you are going to get thanks from your colleagues, and that's just, you'll go home smiling, even if everything's not fixed.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't want to go too much more over time, but I do want to squeeze in one last question. Reflecting on what Tom was presenting on earlier, if behavior can be taught, then is teaching behavior to children with different attitudinal dispositions akin to teaching children to read with different reading abilities? To say the question differently, do you differentiate instruction on the behavior curriculum, Tom?
That's a great question. Yeah, you do. Absolutely you do. If you've got 3 kids in your class and you want to teach them French, and one of them doesn't speak any French, and one of them speaks a little bit, and one is French, right? You're gonna give different tasks. You're gonna teach them different ways. Not quite the personalized learning of mythology, but you start with where the student is, and then you build up on that. Learning is sticky, but what it doesn't mean is you can jump too far ahead. If you've got a child who has the social skills and the attitudinal or dispositional skills of a 5-year-old, you don't ask them to do something complex, like give a presentation to the school. You begin with what they need to know from where they are. Now, what you can do is, if you're teaching at the elementary grade, then that's when you begin with basic things like, here's how we share, here's how we walk, here's the volume of which we speak, and you begin with that. Now, a third of your class are thinking, I know this. Come on. But that's fine. They're overlearning, and overlearning is the core of learning. And a third of your class are going, okay, fine. And a third of your class are thinking, I didn't know we had any rules. So you sweep them all up in this one simple act. So to some extent, you're teaching them all the same stuff, but some kids will require more of it than other children. And you'll find out who they are pretty quick. Because when those children are being removed or exited from the classroom quite a lot because of their behaviors, that's when you, yeah, absolutely, as Daniel's saying, you absolutely go down this is the penalty. You know, you did this crime, so you're going to do this time. But at the same time, if it escalates, if it perpetuates, if it becomes more complex, our response becomes more complex too. And that's where we then step in with much more pastoral responses alongside the punitive responses. That's when we then say, right, what's going on here? Are you okay? Something going on at home? Why are you always angry? Is there something we can do about it? And maybe there isn't, but maybe there is. And that's when you talk about, so for instance, if you go to schools where, special schools, behavior schools, where children go because of misbehavior, the good ones, they'll spend loads of time really teaching children about how to manage complex social situations, how to respond to somebody being rude to them, what to do if they're feeling upset, you know, and that's really basic minutiae for some of these children that many other children wouldn't need. So our response, our consequential response to children should also reflect the fact that a lot of them know much more than others.
Perfect. We're going to leave it there. But before we do, I earlier discussed or mentioned the worst advice I had ever gotten as a teacher: collaborate with your students on classroom rules. I'll close with the best advice I ever got on behavior management. Try this yourself, teachers. I was a fifth grade teacher, and let's be honest, you know, when you get your class list from the experience of your colleagues who are going to be your behavior targets, I was given the advice for the first month or two of school: call home a lot with praise. Find reasons to call home to tell mom and dad, who are probably used to not getting friendly phone calls from school. Oh, no, I'm not, there's no problem. I'm calling because Jose did X, Y, and Z thing beautifully. Oh yeah, thanks for calling. And then when you have those more uncomfortable calls a couple of months down the road, they've got more traction because you're just not that teacher who just calls to complain all the time. Boy, this was a fascinating discussion and long overdue. Tom Bennett, thank you for leading it. Carolyn, Gorman, and Daniel Buck, thank you for joining us. And to our AEI audience, thank you as well. We will see you again in September. Will be our next practice-based webinar when we'll have Tim Shanahan on talking about his new book about leveled reading. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in September.